Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I see a lot of familiar faces. The title of my lecture this evening is Human Nature, What Is It? You know, it is interesting that so many famous thinkers over the centuries have said that to live a fulfilling life, one must understand one's own nature. And to understand one's own nature, one must understand human nature. Perhaps the most famous maxim comes out of ancient Greece. It's one I suspect many of you are familiar with. And the maxim is, know thyself. It's usually attributed to either Socrates or Plato. It is interesting when one ponders the meaning of that expression, know thyself. If one understands a car pretty well, it's likely that one will experience less frustration with the engine of an automobile if one understands how the engine works. By the same token, if one understands how a computer works, I don't understand very well how a computer works, but if one does, it makes using the computer that much more enjoyable and that much less frustrating. But if one is using a computer and one doesn't have a good understanding of it, one will likely encounter much frustration. What does this have to do with human nature? Well, I suspect the same thing is true of human nature, that if one understands oneself, again, I mentioned the Greek maxim, know thyself. If one understands oneself, one's nature, one may be less likely to encounter great frustration in living. Not that we don't all experience some frustration. In fact, part of being a human being is to experience frustration. But perhaps if one understands oneself better, perhaps one can greatly reduce the frustration one encounters in daily living. It is interesting that the Buddha has said that ignorance of one's nature is a chief cause of unhappiness. I'll say that again. The Buddha has said that ignorance of one's nature is a chief cause of unhappiness. Voltaire, one of the great thinkers in history, French philosopher, writer, he said this concerning human nature. He said, history never repeats itself. Man always does. Alexander Pope, very famous English writer, said the proper study of mankind is man. The proper study of mankind is man. Socrates claimed that at one time when he was very young, he was very interested in physics. He was very interested in the sciences. But he concluded that what was even more important than studying the sciences was studying humankind, studying human nature, trying to learn as much about his own nature and other people's nature as possible, so that Socrates' main interest then became human nature. And of course, Socrates is considered to be one of the great philosophers in Western philosophy. Mindful of the World Trade Center tragedy, the issue of human nature, I think, seems more relevant than ever. You might wonder, what are my sources of information, since I'm going to be talking about human nature and what it is? You might wonder, where have I gotten my information from? Well, much of my information comes from literature, the great writers like Tolstoy and Shakespeare. Much of my information will come from psychology, Freud, Adler, Jung, some from philosophy, history, religion, science, and art. What is my purpose? My purpose is to stimulate your thinking about our collective human nature. It is said that if one studies one lion, one will acquire a knowledge of all lions, even though, of course, every lion is unique. Well, I think the same thing is true of human beings, generally speaking. If you know a lot about one human being, you're likely to know a lot about a lot of human beings. Freud, when he was asked, where did you get all your information about human beings from? You know, you've written extensively about human beings. From what sources did you get? And he said, well, I had two primary sources. First, he said, I examined myself. He examined his dreams, among other things, as you well know. And then he said, of course, I examined other people on my couch. And he said, through examining many people and examining myself, I came to at least some tentative conclusions concerning human nature. So again, today I'm hoping to stimulate your thinking about human nature. And beyond that, what I hope to accomplish is this, that if I am successful in stimulating your thinking, perhaps it can help all of us to live more fulfilling lives. As I said before, if one understands a computer pretty well, one is less likely to encounter frustration in using it. By the same token, if one understands one's own nature pretty well, my feeling is that one is less likely to experience undue frustration. Among the basic questions, and there are 4 of them, among the basic questions that I will address this evening are the following. Which characteristics seem to be common among human beings? In other words, which characteristics are typical of most, if not all, human beings? And the characteristics I'll be zeroing in on are psychological, emotional, mental, if one wants to use that word. The second question, given our nature, what tends to fulfill us? Given our nature, what tends to fulfill us? In other words, what's the good life? When one comes to some conclusions about what our nature is, well, then I think one speculates about what might be the good life for creatures of our nature. Thirdly, are there lessons about living a more fulfilling life that we can learn from the world of nature? Are there lessons about living a more fulfilling life that we can learn from the world of nature? For example, from trees, flowers, birds. And finally, the last question that I will address is a very scientific question, and it is, what role do our genes and environment play in determining human nature? Again, what role do our genes and environment play in determining human nature? And among the people I'll be quoting to try to answer this final question are 2 Harvard professors, both internationally known. One is a biologist, Edward O. Wilson, perhaps some of you are familiar with him, and the other is zoologist Stephen Jay Gould. And incidentally, they have some serious disagreements about the role of genes versus the environment in terms of shaping human nature. And again, later on in my lecture, I will be talking about their beliefs. Okay, having said that, let me now address the topic. Again, what is human nature? Joseph Campbell, who is a professor of mythology at Sarah Lawrence University, said this, and I think this provides a good introduction to human nature. He said, and I'm quoting Professor Campbell, "Desire and fear, these are the 2 emotions by which all life in the world is governed." I'll say that again. Desire and fear, these are the 2 emotions by which all life in the world is governed. Let me address myself first to desires, human desires, and then human fears. Socrates said this, "What a dreadful, savage, lawless brood of desires is in everyone, even in some of us who are thought to be decent people." Aristotle said that human desire tends to be insatiable. Human desire tends to be insatiable. Aristotle said that we are so anxious for pleasure that we can never get enough of it. Let me list some of the rather common desires. Desires I suspect we all share, at least most of us share. Desires for delicious food and drink, desires for possessions, whether it be a car or a computer or the latest technological gadgets, desires for status, sex, power, new experiences, emotional security, economic security, and if one is a very religious, spiritual person, the desire for salvation. No discussion of human desire would be complete or even adequate, because I don't intend to make my discussion of human desire complete. It would take too long, and I'm not capable of doing that. But no discussion of human desire would be adequate without quoting Freud, and quoting Freud on the subject for which he is best known, namely sexual desire. So let me give you a brief quote from Freud. This is from one of his most famous books called Civilization and Its Discontents. If you intend to read just one book by Sigmund Freud, I think this should be the book. It's not a very long book. It's only about 200 pages. And why is it considered to be a particularly good book to read? well, it's particularly good to read if you're interested in Freud because it's kind of a summing up of Freud's work. He wrote it rather late in life, so it represents his mature thought. Again, this comes from his book entitled Civilization and Its Discontents. This is Freud on sexual desire. Man's discovery that sexual, genital love afforded him the strongest experiences of satisfaction, and in fact, provided him with the prototype of all happiness, must have suggested to him that he should continue to seek the satisfaction of happiness in his life along the path of sexual relations, and that he should make genital eroticism the central point of his life. Again, and that he should make genital eroticism the central point of his life. Freud goes on to say, the wise men of every age have warned us most emphatically against this way of life. But in spite of this, it has not lost its attraction for a great number of people. So Freud is saying here that many people look to sexual love as the prototype of all happiness. But he adds that the wise men of every age have warned against making sexual love the central point of life. Beyond sexual desire, another very common desire that human beings often share is the desire for approval. Schopenhauer, very famous German philosopher of the 19th century, he said that most human beings are more preoccupied with the thought, what do other people think of me, what will other people think of me, than any other thought. And it's also interesting that J.D. Salinger, a very famous American writer who wrote Catcher in the Rye, also wrote another book called Franny and Zoe, in which he very much addresses himself to this issue of human beings and the desire to be approved of by other human beings. So what I want to do for the next minute or two is just to read you a very short selection by J.D. Salinger, this very famous American writer, from his book Franny and Zoe. Before I read the selection to you, and again it's very brief, let me give you a little background material. This book is about a young lady. Her name is Franny. She's going to an Ivy League type school, and she's been in the theater group. And she decides to quit the theater group. And one of the reasons she decides to quit the theater group at her college is that she comes to the conclusion that she has a very big ego and that she loves applause. And she begins to question herself and whether it's appropriate for human beings to very much want other people's not only approval, but applause. So again, in this very brief selection I'm going to read, Franny is talking to her boyfriend about why she's quit this theater group at college. All I know is I'm losing my mind, Franny said. I'm just sick of ego, ego, ego. My own and everybody else's. I'm sick of everybody that wants to get somewhere, do something distinguished and all, be somebody interesting. Just because I'm so horribly conditioned to accept everybody else's values, and just because I like applause and people to rave about me, doesn't make it right. I'm ashamed of it. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of not having the courage to be an absolute nobody. I'm sick of myself and everybody else that wants to make some kind of splash. Now, this is interesting that she's very concerned about her ego trips and other people's ego trips, and she's questioning whether there's a healthy way to live. And the reason this is so interesting is that virtually all of the great philosophers, virtually all of the great religionists warn about ego trips, warn about being too self-centered. And virtually all of the religionists I have read, and philosophers I have read, and so many writers I have read, conclude that one of the things we should all do if we wish to live more fulfilling lives is to engage in ego reduction. Ego reduction. That one of the things we should all do is to aim at being less self-centered, not more self-centered. That one of the things we should learn to do is to become less conscious and less desirous of other people's approval and more desirous of our own approval. Another desire that human beings have at least many human beings, I think, share, besides the desires for sex and approval, is the desire for power. The desire for power. It is interesting that Alfred Adler, one of the great psychiatrists of this century, in his book called Understanding Human Nature, interesting title for a book, Understanding Human Nature, he zeroes in on this particular human desire, the desire for power. And here's what he says in his book. This is Dr. Adler, again, a colleague of Freud's at one time. Psychiatrist Adler says, the goal of superiority, of power, of the conquest of others is the goal which directs the activities of most human beings. Let me read that again. First time I ever read this, I found it somewhat shocking. Again, he says this, the goal of superiority, of power, of the conquest of others is the goal which directs the activities of most human beings. Now you might wonder, is Adler alone in this belief that human beings are interested in power, or have there been a lot of other psychiatrists, writers, philosophers, religionists who have said similar things? Well, the fact of the matter is, he is in a rather large group of thinkers who have expressed this idea. Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, in a book called The Resurrection, said this, what men considered sacred and important were their own devices for wielding power over their fellow man. Again, this is Tolstoy. What men considered sacred and important were their own devices for wielding power over their fellow man. Robert Audrey, some years ago, wrote a book called African Genesis, in which he studied non-human animals and human animals to try to determine how human animals are similar to non-human animals and how they are different. It's a book which I think many of the people in this group would very much enjoy reading. Again, it's called African Genesis. And here is one of the conclusions Robert Audrey came to about animals and power. And he's not just talking about human animals. He says this, hierarchy is an institution among all social animals, and the drive to dominate one's fellows, an instinct 3 or 4 million years old. Audrey claims if you visit a barnyard and you observe animals in the barnyard, you will find out there is a questing for status, a questing for power among the animals in the barnyard. So he is suggesting that it's not just human animals that have this, what he calls instinct, this instinct for power, but non-human animals as well. And I suspect some people would say this should not surprise us, that perhaps this is a product of our evolution. On this subject of the desire for power, Abigail Adams was the wife of the second president of the United States. She's one of our more famous first ladies, Abigail Adams. And in 1776, in a letter she wrote to her husband, who eventually again became president of the United States, she said this about men and power, and I'm quoting Abigail Adams. Do not put unlimited powers in the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. In summing up this particular segment of my lecture on desires, because that's what I've been focusing in on, human nature and the idea that desires are an aspect of it, if I could just list very briefly some of the more common desires that human beings share. I've already alluded to some, or examples, I should say. These are examples of the desire for power. We mentioned men over the centuries dominating women. In fact, probably in most of the world today, men still dominate women. Masters and slaves, whites dominating black people. And in Africa, some black tribes trying to dominate other black tribes. Imperialism. Virtually all of the major nations in the world today at one time or another embarked on imperialistic programs. The United States, as you know, took over Hawaii, took over the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, other areas as well. England, probably the world's greatest imperialist power. Germany took over other countries. Japan took over other countries. And perhaps these are also examples of human beings' desire for power. The capitalists at one time exercising almost unlimited power over workers before unions became popular in this country and before the government intervened to give workers some power so that they wouldn't be completely at the mercy of employers. Religious wars, religions fighting amongst themselves, often for power. The Christians and the Muslims during Crusades questing for domination of what we now call the Holy Land in the Middle East. And of course, perhaps the best example of people's desires for powers, the numerous dictatorships we have had in history, and that we still have in the world today. Brutal dictatorships, people exercising power without concern for the consequences that their potential abuses of power, their actual abuses of power, have on people. With regard to this desire for power and status, psychiatrist Carl Jung, who was also a colleague of Freud's, he wrote of the power instinct and the sexual instinct. Again, psychiatrist Jung believed people have an instinct for power and an instinct for sex. What did he mean by instinct? Carl Jung believed that an instinct has an element of compulsion in it, element of compulsion. And Jung said this: "It is highly probable that all man's psychic functions have an instinctual foundation, as is obviously the case with animals." I'll repeat that again, because I think this is especially relevant for this group. Psychiatrist Jung says, and now again he's comparing human animals to non-human animals, "It is highly probable that all man's psychic functions have an instinctual foundation, as is obviously the case with animals." One of the questions that arises when people talk about people's desires for power is, why is it that many human beings crave approval, power, and status? Is it simply an instinct? We don't know for sure, by the way. As I said, Jung theorized that much of this is instinctual behavior, but are there other possible explanations for the desire of many human beings for, again, approval, power, and status? Well, Alfred Adler, the gentleman I quoted some minutes ago, who said that most human beings are interested in exercising power over other people, when he was asked, why is this? What's your explanation for the human desire for power? Here is what he said, and I'm quoting Alfred Adler, psychiatrist Alfred Adler. He said, "It is the feeling of inferiority, inadequacy, which determines the goal of an individual's existence." Again, it is the feeling of inferiority, inadequacy, which determines the goal of an individual's existence. Adler believed that one of the reasons so many people are interested in exercising power over other human beings, whether it's husbands over wives, whether it's white people over black people, whether it's imperialist countries over their victims, is that it's a way of compensating for one's inferiority complex. Maxwell Maltz, many years ago, was a rather famous plastic surgeon, and he addressed himself to this concept of the inferiority complex. And here is what plastic surgeon Maxwell Maltz said about it, and I'm quoting him. "At least 95% of the people have their lives blighted by feelings of inferiority to some extent. And to millions, this same feeling is a handicap to success and happiness." Again, he's estimating that perhaps 95% of the people in the world have pretty significant feelings of inferiority. And if he and Adler are right, they are both saying this is one of the things that leads to people's desire to dominate other people. Again, it's a way of compensating for their own inadequacies. H.L. Mencken was one of the most famous journalists of this century. In fact, some people think that, some people regard him as the most famous journalist of this century. He said this about the inferiority complex, and again, I'm quoting him. "In us, the thing works through the inferiority complex, which no man can escape. Our conscious thought is largely devoted to plans and specifications for cutting a better figure in society." I'll say it again. Our conscious thought is largely devoted to plans and specifications for cutting a better figure in society. You recall at the outset, I quoted Joseph Campbell, who said that all life in the world is governed by desire and fear. all life in the world is governed by desire and fear. Well, I spent the last few minutes talking about desire, human desires. Let me now address myself to the issue of human fears. Robert Audrey, whom I quoted before, remember he wrote the book called African Genesis, in which he compared and contrasted non-human animals with human animals and their behavior. He says this: the world of the animal is a world full of fear. The world of the animal is a world full of fear. And Carl Jung, the psychiatrist whom I've quoted several times today, Carl Jung said this: the God of terror dwells in the human soul. The God of terror dwells in the human soul. What did he mean by that? Well, who amongst us has not awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts worried about something? Could be money, it could be a test, it could be a family problem. It's not unusual that sometimes people don't get a good night's sleep because they're afraid of something. So again, Jung refers to the God of terror who dwells in the human soul. What are some of the major fears? Some of the major fears that we human beings experience. Let me list briefly some of them. Fear of loss and extinction, fear of failure, fear of random illness and disaster, fear of the unknown, fears that we are frittering away our days in hectic and meaningless activity, fear of loss of status, fear that we won't get our pleasure, fear of insecurity, fear of insecurity. So far, I've established the idea, or at least I've tried to establish the idea, that among the elements of human nature are desires and fears. I wish to move on now to some other aspects of human nature. Another characteristic, I think, of human beings, and so many writers have spoken about this, is that we are very complicated creatures. My guess is that everybody in this room is a very complicated creature. And Tolstoy, perhaps the greatest novelist who ever lived, addressed himself to this in a book called The Resurrection. And in this book, Leo Tolstoy says that it is the usual practice of human beings to categorize other human beings in the following way: that we say that someone is kind, or we say that someone is wicked, or we say that someone is wise, or that he's foolish, she's foolish, or that he's energetic, she's dull. And Tolstoy objects to this. And let me give you his own words as to why he objects to saying someone is wise or foolish or energetic or dull or good or evil. Tolstoy says this: this is wrong. We may say of a man that he is more frequently kind than cruel, wise than foolish, energetic than apathetic, or vice versa. But it could never be true to say of one man that he is wicked or foolish. And he goes on to elaborate. Every man bears within himself the germs of every human quality, displaying all in turn, and a man can often seem unlike himself, yet he still remains the same. So what Tolstoy is suggesting to us for our examination is the idea that even wise people sometimes act foolishly, that even kind people sometimes act unkindly. In fact, it is interesting that Aristotle said there is a foolish corner in the mind of the wisest man. There is a foolish corner in the mind of the wisest man. And Schopenhauer, the famous German philosopher whom I quoted before, Schopenhauer said this, and I'm using the English translation, of course, because he wrote in German, but Schopenhauer said, every genius is in some way stupid. Every genius is in some way stupid, and that's how he shows his kinship with the rest of humanity. So Schopenhauer, if he were here today talking about this, I think he would suggest to you that if you visited Harvard or Yale or Cambridge or Oxford, that you should keep in mind that even those professors are stupid in certain ways. Again, stupid is his word, it's not my word. Again, the English translation of the German. It is also interesting that much research has been done on intelligence in recent years. So much of the research has been done by Professor Howard Gardner at Harvard. He still teaches at Harvard. And one of Professor Gardner's conclusions is that we should be reluctant to say that someone is more intelligent than someone else, because he says there are so many different species of intelligence. And he says school measures a very small area of people's aptitudes. So that if someone has done well in school and someone else has not done well in school, that's no basis for a conclusion that one is more intelligent than the other. If you want to read a very good book, by the way, about this idea of intelligence and the impossibility, really, of measuring one's intelligence. We used to give IQ tests, thinking with one test we can measure somebody. Howard Gardner finds that ludicrous, that a test, one test, can measure somebody's intelligence. I want to read a very good book on this subject. It's called Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, also a Harvard PhD, who was a student of Professor Gardner's at Harvard. Okay, what I'm doing now, again, is pursuing the idea that we human beings are complicated creatures. And I've already tried to establish the idea that it might be wrong to say someone is wise or foolish or good or evil, etc., because perhaps we are, each of us is all of those things. Blaise Pascal was a very famous French philosopher, also a mathematician and a physicist. And Pascal said this about how complicated we are, and I'm quoting Pascal. He said, there are two natures in us, the one good, the other bad. These are his own words. There are two natures in us, the one good, the other bad. Jesus, commenting on our dark side, Jesus on our dark side said this, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Remember, I said that Pascal believed there are two natures in us, one good and one bad. Carl Jung, whom I've quoted several times this evening, he said this, the self is a union of opposites. The self is a union of opposites. The individual is confronted with the abysmal contradictions of human nature. For in the self, good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins. In the self, good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins. Freud also commented on how complicated we are. One of the words Freud often used to describe human behavior was ambivalent. He said we often have mixed feelings. We often have exactly the opposite feelings about the same thing. And in fact, the best illustration I think Freud gave was this, and perhaps you're all familiar with this. Freud said it is not at all unusual that we human beings, because we are so complicated, will love and hate the same person. We will love and hate the same person, if that is true. And it's for you, I think, to determine whether it is true. Again, another indication about how complicated we are. Albert Camus, famous existentialist philosopher, was very optimistic about human nature. He said this, man is more good than bad. Man is more good than bad. Henry Adams, a professor at Harvard in the 1800s, 19th century, he was not so optimistic. He said, average human nature is very coarse. Average human nature is very coarse. And one wonders, coarse, rough. And one wonders, is Camus correct? Is Camus correct that man is more good than bad? Let me pursue this idea for a moment. In a very famous novel called Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, some people think it's the best novel ever written by a Brit, even a better novel than what Dickens turned out. In this book called Tom Jones is a young man, and he travels about in the novel, and he comes across a hermit. My recollection is he comes across this man in the woods, and this man is very much a loner, and they have a conversation. And Tom Jones, this young man, gets the impression that this old hermit hates people. And the young man says to this old man, he says, you know, I get this impression that you don't like human beings very much. And he said, I can understand that. He said, you've probably had a lot of bad experiences with people in your life. But he said, you know, don't judge human beings by the worst amongst us. Judge human beings by the best amongst us. And Aristotle believed the same thing. Let me quote Aristotle on this subject of how to judge human nature and judging it on the basis of the best of the species, not the worst. Aristotle said, if we see what the best man is like, we are seeing at the same time what man's true nature is. We understand the species by understanding the perfect individual. I'll say it again. We understand the species by understanding the perfect individual. Are we to judge human nature by by the abolitionists in American history, the people who want to abolish slavery, or are we to judge human nature by some of the brutal slave owners? Again, there were brutal slave owners on one hand, and there were very kind abolitionists who were trying to do away with slavery on the other hand. Well, which group do we use to judge human nature? Do we judge, if we take Germany as an example, do we judge human nature by focusing in on the Nazis? Or do we judge human nature by focusing in on those Germans who tried to protect Jewish people, very often at the risk to their own lives? Do we judge human nature by obsessing about corrupt politicians and businessmen? Or do we judge human beings by focusing in on whistleblowers, people who risk their jobs, even their reputations, to try to protect the public? Jeffrey Wigand, the tobacco whistleblower, perhaps a good example, was making $300,000 a year at one time, PhD, I think, in chemistry, as a researcher for one of the major tobacco companies. And since he blew the whistle, he, of course, has been fired, and now he is a teacher making $30,000 a year. Again, went from making $300,000 to $30,000 a year. Okay, so far, among the ideas I've expressed are the following. I've tried to stimulate your thinking about some of the characteristics of human nature, and I've suggested to you that human beings are desirous, they're fearful, and they're complicated. Let me go on to another possible characteristic. I suggest to you that human beings also have an inclination for mask wearing. Human beings also have an inclination to mask wearing. Schopenhauer said, "We all wear a mask and play a role." Mark Twain, one of the great American writers, said this, "What a wee little part of a person's life are his words and his acts. His real life is led in his head and is known to none but himself." Charles Dickens, in A Tale of Two Cities, wrote this, "What a wonderful fact to reflect upon, that every human being is constituted to be that profound secret and mystery to every other human being." And Hermann Hesse, Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, said this, "No man has ever been entirely and completely himself. No man has ever been entirely and completely himself." And Thoreau, probably my favorite philosopher, Thoreau said, "And why should I speak to my friends? For how rarely it is that I am I, and are they then they?" Again, he's talking about mask wearing. And why should I talk to my friends? For how rarely it is that I am I, and are they then they? Jesus also spoke about this in Matthew 7. Jesus said, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits." So Jesus talks about people who come to you, giving you the appearance of sheep, when in fact they are wolves. How many of us in our lives have had to deal with some con people, con men, con women, whom we thought were sheep, and we later find out were wolves because they were wearing the mask of sheep. With regard to this inclination for mask wearing, psychiatrist Jung distinguished between a person's persona and a person's anima. Psychiatrist Jung said the persona is our mask. The anima is our unconscious, true inner self. Again, the persona is our mask, and the anima is our unconscious, true inner self. So again, he's distinguishing between the two. No discussion of human nature, would be adequate without incorporating some ideas of Freud's. And let me give you a few paragraphs from Freud, very brief, in which he talks about human nature in as explicit a way as he does in any of his writings. Again, this is Freud on human nature. These are his own words, and this is not pretty. This is not pretty. "Men are not gentle creatures. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. As a result, their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture him, and to kill him." And he says this in Latin, "Homo homini lupus." And what does that mean? Homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to man. Those are Freud's words. Man is a wolf to man. And Freud tries to use history, among other things, tries to use history to prove his point. And he says this: who in the face of all his experience of life and of history will have the courage to dispute this assertion? Man is revealed as a savage beast to whom consideration of his own kind is something alien. And he talks about all the atrocities in history. He talks about all the invasions in history. And he talks about the recent World War, World War I. Indeed, two of Freud's sons fought at the front line in World War I, the most brutal war that has ever been fought. Freud says this: the existence of this inclination to aggression, which we can detect in ourselves and justly assume to be present in others. He says this: aggressiveness is an indestructible feature of human nature. Those are his own words. I'll say it again. Again, this is Freud. Aggressiveness is an indestructible feature of human nature. Is Freud alone in this rather negative view of human nature? No, he's not. Carl Sagan, very famous scientist who taught at Cornell for some years, and in fact was on television for many years, had a science program. Carl Sagan talked about the reptilian core in humankind, the reptilian core, and he explained what he meant by that. He said the reptilian core in us is that kernel of savagery left untouched by the process of evolution. That kernel of savagery in us left untouched by the process of evolution. Many of you might be thinking right now, should we be afraid of each other? Should we be afraid of each other? I mean, this is rather a bleak picture of human nature that Freud paints. And Sagan and more than a few other writers have given their assent to Freud's description. They claim that, for the most part, he was right. No, I don't think we should be afraid of each other. And why do I think we should not be afraid of each other? Well, I think perhaps our salvation is our complexity. Perhaps our salvation is our complexity. Allow me to explain. Joseph Campbell provides some bad news and some good news. He says, first of all, aggression is a natural instinct, just as much as and more immediate than compassion. It is always going to be there. It's a biological fact. So Professor Campbell is saying, yes, aggression is an instinct in us, but so is compassion. And Eric Hoffer, who years ago was regarded as the longshoreman philosopher, because he actually did work on the docks in San Francisco, Eric Hoffer has said something about compassion that I think is just quite beautiful. And not just beautiful, but inspiring, and gives us some hope. Eric Hoffer said this, and I'm quoting him. Compassion alone stands apart from the continuous traffic between good and evil proceeding within us. Compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. Where there is compassion, even the most poisonous impulses remain relatively harmless. Again, compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. Where there is compassion, even the most poisonous impulses remain relatively harmless. So again, it is interesting. We may have an instinct for aggression, but we may also have an instinct for compassion. Perhaps the World Trade Center tragedy illustrates this, aggression and compassion. Think about all the rescuers, the volunteers, the compassion they showed. Did you know that almost 1/3 of New Yorkers have given blood? Did you know that people have contributed almost $1 billion to the fund to help the people who suffered as a consequence? So yes, we are capable of aggression, hatred, and evil. We are capable of aggression, hatred, and evil, but we are also capable of compassion, of love, and of goodness. Note St. Francis of Assisi, Albert Schweitzer, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, Rosa Parks, Mahatma Gandhi, political dissidents all over the world, willing to risk going to jail to promote freedom in their countries, whistleblowers, all of them human beings. How encouraging. All of those people, human beings, how encouraging. Of course, another aspect of human nature is that we all experience unhappiness, even suffering. I suspect there is nobody in this room who doesn't experience anxiety, nervousness, fatigue, disappointment, injustice, sickness, envy. In fact, Schopenhauer and Russell claim that we should look upon other people as our fellow sufferers. The Buddha believed something similar also, that since we human beings do suffer a lot, we should, in the way of compassion, regard other people as fellow sufferers. Now again, you might think, that's pretty negative. Phil, can you say something to give us a little joy? I mean, that's pretty depressing, looking upon all of us as, looking upon all of our fellow men as fellow sufferers. Well, yes, I can give all of us some hope in that, yes, we suffer, but isn't it also true that we all experience joy? We all experience happiness, a gorgeous spring day, a child's lovely face, showing others affection, being of service to others, fighting for justice, music. Nietzsche said, life without music would be a mistake. Reading. Professor Harold Bloom of Yale has said that reading, and I'm quoting him, is the most healing of pleasures. Reading is the most healing of pleasures. Art, good memories, all of these things, sources of happiness. So again, if I can summarize what I've said so far, I've suggested to you that among the characteristics of human beings are the following. We are desirous, we are fearful, we are complicated, we have an inclination to mask wearing, we are aggressive, but capable of love and goodness. We suffer, but we're also capable of joy. And also, if I might add, we have a tendency to live in the future. I think so many of us do that. That's very human. I don't know that that's a good idea. What I would like to do now is to raise this question. What tasks does our human nature impose on us? In other words, given our nature, what fulfills us? Given our nature, what fulfills us? And let me try to stimulate your thinking. I suggest to you one of the things that fulfills us is introspection. Pascal, remember, said there are two natures in us, the one good and the other bad. Carl Jung has said that one of the obligations every human being has to himself is to engage in introspection, to look at what's good in oneself, but also to examine the shadow in oneself. Jung called the negative aspects of our nature the shadow. And he has said if the world is ever to be a better place, human beings must be cognizant not only of their potential for good, but also for their potential for evil. Of course, I mentioned that Jung talks about not overlooking our potential for evil, but of course we should not overlook the good we do each day. Remember, Pascal said there are two natures. The one is good, and each of us is a process. Each of us is a process. We're always in a state of becoming. Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, remarked that when he was very young, he made up a program for himself, self-improvement program, in which he dedicated himself to cultivating certain virtues, such as temperance, such as modesty, such as humility, such as self-discipline. And he said that while he was never able to achieve the virtues in the degree to which he wanted, that nevertheless, since he aimed at self-improvement, he was a better person than if he had not aimed at self-improvement. So what Franklin tried to do was to be introspective about himself, what was good about himself, what was bad about himself, and to work on those aspects of himself that might have been negative. Alexander Pope said that the proper study of mankind is man, and he believed that one of the things we can do to fulfill ourselves is to learn. One of the things we can do to fulfill ourselves is to learn. Learn what? Well, learn how to deal with anxiety, learn how to deal with nervousness, learn how to deal with disappointment, with boredom, with injustice, with other people. Understanding the sources of one's anxiety and nervousness. Again, if we are to fulfill our nature, it seems to me, we have to understand the sources of our anxiety and our nervousness. The Buddha said that much of our pain is self-chosen. Much of our pain is self-chosen. And perhaps if we are very introspective, we can examine what suffering we are bringing upon ourselves. Also, in order to fulfill ourselves, I think it's incumbent upon us that we learn mindfulness, This is a Buddhist term. The Buddhists believe that we should use our mind to observe our mind, that we should use our mind to observe ourselves when we are feeling angry, when we are feeling sad, when we are feeling nervous. The Buddhist would say to himself, gee, I'm feeling angry now. And he said to himself, I'm feeling angry. What's the antidote to that? Or I'm feeling fearful now. I'm feeling fearful now. I'm aware of that. What's the antidote? Or I'm feeling joyful now. What's the cause of this joy? So I can bring this joy about some other time as well. Again, what's the goal? The goal is understanding oneself, warts and all, and understanding the material you're dealing with, namely human nature. An important question is, which fulfills us more? Amusing ourselves or deepening ourselves? Learning more about ourselves and other people and the nature of life? Is our human nature such that learning, growing, and understanding make life more satisfying and worthwhile than passively amusing ourselves? I'll say it again. Is our human nature such that learning, growing, and understanding make life more satisfying and worthwhile than passively amusing ourselves? Another important learning for us would be learning to love other people. So many of the great writers have said if we are to fulfill ourselves, we must learn to love other people. Bertrand Russell said this about the good life. He said, "The good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge." The good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge. Sogyal Rinpoche, famous Buddhist thinker, said there are only two things that are important in life. Rinpoche, famous Buddhist thinker, said there are only two things that are important in life: acquiring knowledge and learning to love others. Acquiring knowledge and learning to love others. Is it possible that our human nature is such that caring about others and serving others actually makes us happier? Is it possible that not giving a damn about others, having no concern for justice, just looking out for number one, makes us less happy? And another important question: how is our human nature connected to the rest of nature? How is our human nature connected to the rest of nature, to all non-human life? How is our human nature connected to trees, flowers, birds, dogs, butterflies, and so many other forms of life? Is our human nature such that a disregard for, a lack of love for non-human life not only diminishes us, but makes us less happy? More proof, perhaps, that selfishness, self-centeredness is in the long run self-destructive. Writer Mary McCarthy talked a lot about nature, and she says its echo is human nature. She said that nature is two-sided. It's serene, it's beautiful, it's pleasant, a lovely spring day, but nature can also be wild. Nature can also be wild, tempestuous, frightening, a hurricane, a tornado. And in this line, Seneca, famous philosopher, advises us to bring our wills into tune with nature's. That Seneca says that just as clear skies follow cloudy, after the calm comes the storm, day succeeds night. It is by means of opposites that eternity endures. So just as nature has a serene quality and a wild quality, we too have a serene quality and a wild quality. And in that sense, perhaps we are like nature. Thoreau talked about how his moods corresponded to nature. He noted that the seasons and all their changes are in me. He added that even in his moods, he now felt the perfect correspondence of nature to man. You know, many artists, painting landscapes, painting seascapes, try to use landscapes and skiscapes to portray human feelings. Van Gogh in many of his paintings, many of his landscapes, shows the correspondence between human feelings and nature, serenity and tempestuousness in nature. Also, just as nature flowers, so too can there be a flowering of a human being. So I'm wondering, to fulfill ourselves, if we are going to fulfill ourselves, isn't it very important for us to be in harmony with nature, with the world of nature? Let me bring this to a conclusion now. I mentioned before that I wanted to incorporate science into my lecture. And very briefly, let me contrast. First of all, the question is, what is the role of our genes and our environment in determining human nature? Edward O. Wilson, a biologist at Harvard, has said that the essence of human nature is sketched out by the genes. The essence of human nature is sketched out by the genes. He talks about epigenetic rules. Epigenetic rules are genetically based neural wiring in us genetically based neural wiring in us which predispose us to favor certain types of action. He believes, for example, that we are predisposed to patriotism, status-seeking, territorial expansion because of our evolution. He says the search for human nature can be viewed as the archaeology of the epigenetic rules. So again, biologist Wilson emphasizes genes. Well, his colleague at Harvard, Stephen Jay Gould, has a different take. He emphasizes environment. And Stephen Jay Gould, in commenting on the most recent research on the human genome, says that the most recent research which has been done may finally liberate us from the simplistic and false idea that each aspect of our being, either physical or behavioral, may be ascribed to the action of a particular gene for that trait in question. And he's very specific. Professor Gould talks about Lincoln's expression, the better angels of our nature. Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, appealed to the better angels of our nature. And Professor Gould says, you will not find the better angels of our nature on gene 26, chromosome 12. So that Stephen Jay Gould, again, disagrees with Professor Wilson. He comes down more on the side of environment. Well, who's right? Well, we don't know who is right. The question is the balance. We know that genes and environment contribute to making us what we are, but we don't know exactly which contributes more. What I would like to do in closing is to close with these thoughts. Immanuel Kant, one of the great philosophers, in talking about human beings, said that the just person is the noblest product of creation. The just person is the noblest product of creation. Oscar Wilde said that what distinguishes one human being from another is the capacity to love. And finally, Gandhi said, what matters after all is that our capacity for loving ever expands. Gandhi, what matters after all is that our capacity for loving ever expands. And I thank you very much.